name's Derek, and I'm a researcher here at the University of St. Andrews. And I'm here to answer your questions about philosophy of mind and philosophy of language. Over the past week, we've received so many amazing questions that unfortunately I can't answer all of them. But here are my answers to my top 3 questions. Katie asks, how will we ever know if a computer is conscious? That's a really great question, Katie. And I want to mention that several other people had similar questions. So Haley, Jeffrey, Billy, Stephanie, Hank, Leslie, and Mia, I think what I'm about to say might give you some tools for thinking about your questions too. Okay, so Katie's asking about consciousness. What is that? Well, when philosophers talk about consciousness, they're talking about experiences. So if you stub your toe and feel a pain in your foot, that feels a certain way. That's a conscious experience. If you open your eyes and look out and see color or feel something brushing against your skin, those all feel a certain way. Those are examples of conscious experience. In general, anything that there is something it's like to experience is an example of consciousness. So what Katie is really asking is, how will we know if there's something it's like to be a computer? Now, there are different kinds of views about what kind of thing consciousness is. So we know consciousness has something to do with our brains, but that leaves it open exactly what kind of feature of our brains matters. So some people think it has something to do with biology. It's something like having certain kinds of nerve cells or certain kind of neurochemical activity in our brains, and that's what feeling pain is. This is sometimes called the identity theory because it's saying consciousness just is identical to a certain kind of brain state. Other people think the biological details don't matter so much. What really matters is how the brain works, how it processes information and generates our behavior. People sometimes call this kind of view functionalism because it's saying what matters is how the brain functions. You can see that this will matter when we're thinking about something like a fish. Fish have brains that are different from ours, so they don't have some of the kinds of brain states that are involved in us feeling pain. But nonetheless, their brains seem to process information and cause their behavior in broadly similar ways to ours. So the identity theorist might say, well, fish can't feel pain because they don't have the right kind of brain state. But the functionalist might say, well, they don't have the same brain state we do, but they have one that works the same way, and that's what really matters. Similarly with computers, it looks like if the identity theory is right, then computers can never be conscious, or at least they can't have the same kind of conscious states that we have. And that's just because they'll never have the right kind of neurobiology. They aren't biological things at all. If the functionalist is right, then we might be able to make computers that are conscious, and we might be able to know that they're conscious just by studying how they work. In order to think a little bit more clearly about which of these views might be right or how we could decide, I want to turn to my second question. My second question is from Douglas. Douglas asks, how do I know that the way I see the world is the same as others? For instance, is my green the same as yours? So I think what Douglas is wondering here is something like, is the way grass looks to me the way that things like post boxes look to you, and vice versa, so that all our red and green experiences are kind of switched? That's a really good question. Now, there may be some reasons for thinking that our experiences are the same. There may be reasons in our behavior. Some scientists have studied things like this. But there also may be reasons coming from the kinds of issues that we discussed in answer to Katie's question. So for example, if we have similar biology, our brains function in similar ways, then the kind of views we discussed before, the functionalist or identity theory views, will predict that our experiences should be the same. But still, a lot of philosophers have thought that the kind of question Douglas is asking gives us reasons to rethink these kind of views of consciousness. So here's an example from the 20th century Australian philosopher Frank Jackson. Jackson imagined Mary. Mary is a scientist who's been raised her whole life in a black and white environment, so she never has seen color. But despite this, Jackson thought, she could come to learn everything there is to know about the brain. She learns from her black and white books and black and white computer monitors, everything there is to know about light and so on, and eyes. But nonetheless, Jackson thought there was something that she can't know, what it's like to see red. The only way you can know that is by actually seeing it. You can never learn it from a black and white book, or so Jackson thought. And Jackson thought that this showed that views like the identity theory and functionalism can't be right, because if what it's like to see red is just a matter of what's going on in the brain, Mary ought to know it. She knows everything that's going on in the brain. But she doesn't, so therefore consciousness must be something different. So that's another view, another kind of view to consider here that might make more room for the way I see the world being very different from the way you see the world. Of course, many philosophers think that this is a mistake. Really, what Jackson is doing is inferring something about the way consciousness is from the way we think about it or our knowledge of it. And our knowledge or our thought about it might just be confused. So this remains a very controversial kind of view, but it's something to consider in the context of Douglas's question. Finally, my third question is from Bogdan. Bogdan asks, is it possible to teach an animal to speak? Well, that's a great question. In one sense, you might think the answer is obvious. It's obviously yes, because look at things like parrots. We have taught parrots to parrot our words, to repeat things that we say. But it seems like there's something missing from what the parrots are doing. And it's much less clear whether we can ever teach animals to speak in the way that we do, or indeed whether they do the things that we do in their own natural forms of communication. So the crucial issue here is, what is distinctive about human language? And linguists, psychologists, philosophers, biologists have had different kinds of ideas about this. One thing that I think we can set aside is physical limitations. It's a good question whether any other animals can make the same sounds that we can. Maybe parrots can, but maybe chimpanzees can't. Still, we might be able to teach them sign language or to use a keyboard or something like that. So that's not really the relevant limitation. Another kind of answer proposed by the 20th century philosopher Paul Grice has to do with the kind of mental states that are involved in our communication. So think about something like blushing. That's just an involuntary reaction. It just happens to you. You don't choose to do it or do it for a reason. It just happens when you're embarrassed. Nonetheless, it can be a kind of communication. People can infer something about how you're feeling if you're blushing. But it's not something you do with an aim in mind. Now, Grice noticed that most language use isn't like this. Most language use is something you do intentionally. In particular, you do it to get someone to form a belief or to change their belief. So I'm telling you something, I'm trying to get you to believe something. And it's really unclear whether any animals other than humans can do this. This is a thing called theory of mind. And there's been a lot of research looking for theory of mind in non-human animals. Some very recent evidence suggests that chimpanzees maybe can think of each other as having beliefs, as having minds, but most animals just don't seem to think that way. And if that's right, that would be one thing that's distinctive in our communication that it seems like animals can't do. Well, I hope you enjoyed my attempts to answer these questions. If you'd like to learn more about philosophy, you can check out our What Kind of Mind website. This has resources that were developed for teachers, but might be good for homeschool too, for thinking about philosophy and psychology and animals. Next week, we'll be answering your questions about cell biology and disease. If you haven't already, send in any questions about cell biology to this email address or post them in the comments by Friday the 8th of May. Thanks for watching!